This is Stigma, where we talk with leaders from many industries about how mental health and addiction have impacted their lives. Many people suffer silently from mental illness, addiction, depression, anxiety, and trauma. They never seek help because of stigma. In this podcast, host Stephen Hayes and his guests share their stories of recovery in order to encourage others to do the same. Here's Stephen.
Welcome back to another episode of the Stigma Podcast. Today's guest is Nick Padlo. Nick is a longtime friend. He's a West Point classmate of mine from the class of 2003. He also has an MBA from the Stanford Graduate School of Business. And after graduate school, Nick raised a bunch of money via a pledge fund to acquire a small business in the pet industry, and he grew that into a rather large and successful business, and he's had a number of commercial successes along with that. But Nick has also struggled like I have with addiction and other issues, and he's here today to share his story, including his time in Southeast Asia, learning how to execute mindfulness practices and take care of himself after rehab. So excited to have him here. There's a number of ways you can get in touch with Nick. I will link to those in the show notes. But without further ado, Nick, thanks for coming on, man.
All right, Steve. Yeah, thanks for having me on. It's funny kind of hearing the story, about what I've done in my life, kind of sans some of the addiction problems. And I didn't mention them, but, that's kind of taken up a great part of my mind share for the last several years. As you mentioned, kind of had a glide path through things for quite a while. West Point went well, and my time in the Army went well. Was fortunate enough to go to Stanford, which was just a super blessing. I like to think of it as an admissions mistake, but it turned out everything worked out. So after that, had some good career moves, and really kind of the most exciting part of my career to date was this launch of the Pet Loss Center. And that was as you mentioned, it was a search fund acquisition, but really the exciting part wasn't the acquisition. It was the 4 years of running it. And, I think back to the beginning, and it's similar to the story of a lot of entrepreneurs where, I remember nights sleeping at the office on a cot. I remember thinking that the world was ending each month, and sometimes multiple times in a day. Turns out the world didn't end any of those times. And I learned a powerful mantra, which is nothing is ever as good or bad as it seems when it comes to startups. And so continued to work my way through that. And there was kind of a in the midst of all of that, and I don't think that it was a cause of, it's not, my story is not one where it says entrepreneurship caused a addiction problem. I got so busy and it was so hard and stressful that I, turned to alcohol. That's not really my story. Mine was more, at least in my mind, as I replay it, more on the personal side. I was kind of, my marriage wasn't going as well as I had planned. And I think just kind of slowly and gradually, as I kind of felt that starting to fade, I would just cope with alcohol a little bit. And, it started from taking the edge off after work to, taking the edge off with a few drinks and then several drinks. And I think at that point, it still was probably, and this is about 3 years into the startup at this point, the startup's doing really well. It started to turn from, a few drinks to several, but again, it was manageable in my mind until things kind of went south. And when I got a divorce, then it was, I just had this handy friend that was sitting right there that I'd used to deal with kind of moderate discomfort and sadness. But now I was starting to get into the land of depression, and the knowing that there was something there that could, quote, help me with that. That was what I turned to. And, several drinks became several plus several. From then it kind of became a story of where, as I learned later in rehab, my problem was no longer sadness or depression, but I now had two problems, right? So I've got the problem of sadness and depression, but alcohol has become its own problem. And, as that grew and grew in size and scope, I went ahead and my depression was getting worse, right? They spiral. And obviously a lot of people on your podcast have talked about this, where, the mental health issues get worse as the drinking problems get worse. And so ended myself up in rehab in 2019. And I'm sure we can talk about that a little bit. Really an amazing place. And at this point I was in kind of another unhealthy life situation with relationships and friendships, and, figured 30 days was enough to solve all of my problems. And it was not. So I walked away from the startup. I did my 30 days and I was fixed, but I was not fixed. And so walked right back into the same situation and relapsed. And then, was thankful enough to be able to, and this one was worse than the first one. And so was thankful enough to make the decision to go at it again and go to rehab a second time, at which point, as you mentioned, I needed some aftercare. And, aftercare, within the mental health community, often takes the form of sober living homes. And that was what I was planning on doing. And, in true Nick Padlo fashion, I made a decision 3 days before leaving that instead of sober living, I was going to go to Southeast Asia and work on mindfulness. And much to the chagrin of all of my counselors and doctors, but it ended up being a great trip that was perfect for me specifically. And I'm sure we'll get into that more, but I'm kind of on the back end of that now. And I've got about 126 days, I believe, under my belt. And so feeling great. And now it's time to reacclimate and get myself back on a more traditional program now that I'm back home. But that's kind of been my story. And we can kind of dive into some of the more interesting parts there.
Man, that's incredible. It's a great story, dude. And I'm glad you're well. And, we obviously crossed paths a number of times throughout both of our struggles. And man, it's just good to see you well. One thing I'm curious about is, you went to rehab once and then you went again. The first time you went, what was the thing that made you go? And the second time you went, what was the path to making that decision to go again?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, man. I think the first time I went, I definitely went to fix a relationship or to fix myself to be better for a relationship. I think there are a lot of things that we tell ourselves in our depression, and we say, well, if only I could be better, then this would work. If only I could fix myself. And so, it does a couple things. And it doesn't take away from the lessons that I learned at rehab. I mean, I think, I came to the point the first time where I accepted that I had a problem, which was good. I came to the point where I knew the things that I needed to do mentally. I was a great student. I did all the homework very well, but it was purely a mental exercise. Not purely, it was largely a mental exercise for me to figure out intellectually how I could get better. And it turns out that's just not enough. Obviously, not necessarily going for the right reasons, though I would encourage anyone to go for the wrong or right reasons. If you're debating going, you probably should go. But that was really the first time. And then the second time, it was just squarely for me. I knew that if it was either death or rehab the second time, and I wasn't going to make it. So, and I needed to do it. Not to say that, at the time I felt that this was my last shot, right? That if this didn't work, then that was it. And I think that's a misnomer. I mean, I know people from the community that have been through that several times and still live to talk about it. I don't want to do that. I don't plan on doing that. But that was really where my head was at, was that this is the last shot, and I had to do it for me. And the second time, it was more about kind of one of my therapists said, you can't think your way through this, Nick, which is, unfortunate, because I thought my way through everything in my life. So now you're telling me I have to do something different. But I definitely put a lot more heart into it. And I think that was one of the big differences for me, was that I let myself kind of feel my way through rehab rather than try to think through it.
So maybe the first time, I know that when I went, I got a psychoeducation. I learned so much about myself that I wish they had taught me in college or in high school or some other time, just basics about how the human body, the human brain works. And so I learned a lot. And that's interesting that you said the first time through, you were like, you nailed the homework and you kind of you went through the motions and did the thing. And then the second time through, you really felt your way through. Did you get a lot more out of it the second time through, even though it was all the same homework, same classes, same lectures? What I guess really your intent changed, and that changed the outcome. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. So part of it is intent, and I think part of it was I just needed more work. I needed more time, and I think that I think about it. I use an analogy that I will circle back to when I get into the Southeast Asia stuff. It's kind of like yoga. When you're first learning it, all you're doing is thinking about how to do it. Right? You're learning. Okay, my arm goes here. I lean this way. I push this, I pull this. And so it's all intellectual because you have to in order to get it, right? But then once you've, learned the poses, once you understand the intellectual side of it, then you can start to clear your mind, dive into your feelings, focus on your breath, and do those other things that are more internal to your body rather than just your mind. And so I don't know that learning it was, intellectually was bad. I think it was potentially, in my mind, just the first step out of two, and I just never got to step two.
So when you talk about yoga and mindfulness practices, had you ever done anything like that before you went to rehab?
So no, nothing, not one bit. I was, just like you, I was an Army guy. The thought of doing a yoga class. I mean, I've made fun of people who took yoga classes my entire life, right?
Right.
As I'm sure you did at some point.
100%. Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, that was the base that I was coming from. I mean, I dated a girl who was a yoga instructor for 3 years and never took a class. So if that tells you where I was at on that, I mean, I didn't even take a courtesy class, right, to support. So I was really not into that. And as far as, the mindfulness meditation, Buddhism, stuff like that, not at all. I'd gotten to the point where I was having feelings. I think for the first 30 years of my life, I didn't really have any feelings. Or at least if you ask my mom, that's what she would say. And everything was just a mental exercise. And, but then I started to have feelings, but I didn't know what to do with them. Right. So this is all new to me. I'm like, why am I sad? Why am I falling in love? Why am I what are all these things? I've heard people talk about these. I kind of thought that they were like the, Santa Claus, but it turns out you can have them. And here I am now trying to figure out what to do with them. And so, I wouldn't have guessed that it was meditation, and it really started there. And that was, a function of rehab, which is, a lot of mindfulness and DBT, which is dialectical behavior therapy. They really focus on diving in rather than running away from the emotions, and it actually makes you less emotional, which is the ironic part. But that was my first introduction to it was in rehab.
Yeah, same for me. I thought it was silly. And then I saw they hooked my brain up to one of these monitors and they showed me how the frequencies in my prefrontal cortex were behaving in just a resting state. And then when I just did some breathing exercises, I saw how much my brain changed. And that from that point on, I was sold around mindfulness and doing meditating and just even breathing exercises. So you learn this in rehab, you have this experience, and then you decide, hey, my therapist says I should go to a sober living, and screw it, I'm going to go to Southeast Asia and hang out for a few months. How'd that come about?
Yeah, I'm not really sure. I think it was because they gave me a weekend. Not they gave me a weekend. It just happened to be a weekend before I checked out. I think I was checking out on a Tuesday. And so all my plans were set. And we had an outing to this kind of Buddhist Zen garden thing. And it wasn't even really a very good garden. It was very, like, I don't even know if I meditated. I meditated for like a minute there or two. And then I did some breath work on Sunday with one of the counselors. It was kind of, I don't know where it started. I think it was something that I'd always thought about doing, some type of travel to do martial arts or something in Asia. And then when we went to this little garden, I said, man, what I really need, what is missing from my skill set, and can I get that through an IOP, or can I get that through something else? And so IOP is intensive outpatient program. And essentially what that is it's a step down from inpatient care. And that's kind of the plan that everybody takes along with sober living concurrently. And so it's a few hours a day. And I said to myself, man, I don't really, I've been through this twice, and I don't need a step down junior varsity version of the intellectual portions of this that I've already nailed. Right. Going back to what I said before, I got it. I've memorized everything in the book at this point, And so, telling my story of why I turned to alcohol and other substances and, all that stuff I felt like I'd done. And so I said, what is it that I'm missing? And it was really what I mentioned earlier that I didn't get until the second time, which is this is, feeling my way through it. The mindfulness, like that was the stuff that was new and novel to me. And I said, well, where's the best place to learn that? And I said, all right, well, I guess the East is the best place to learn that. So let's look at some programs. And, thankfully I was on a budget. So the last thing you think of is, hey, let me go travel for 3 months. But it turned out, once you get to the plane flight, the days there are pretty cheap. So it ended up being cheaper than sober living for me to go and have a program where I'm solely focused on mindfulness. And I don't know that I recommend this to everyone, right? It was what worked for me, and it was, me doing a self inventory of what gaps I had in my early recovery. And for me, that was really the emotional side, the mindfulness, and it wasn't necessarily more therapy or more intellectual understanding of what was going on from a mental standpoint or whatever.
What did those days look like there? I mean, because I think a lot of people hear this and go, I don't know how to, I can't learn how to do that. I can't learn how to meditate. Every time I meditate, I get distracted. So what does that learning process look like?
Yeah. So, we'd done some in rehab, right? So I felt good for, several minutes of meditation, right? I wasn't the guy that was meditating an hour, I wasn't the guy that was meditating for 30 minutes, but I was starting to feel more comfortable. I was able to relax. I was able to clear my mind a little bit. But when I went, so the place that I went to, I'll give it a plug. It's called Vagabond Temple in Cambodia. And it was, I guess you could call it a yoga retreat or a yoga camp, but it was certainly a lot more than that. And so I think, what you choose in terms of the program would be super important if you're thinking about something like this. But in the mornings, we did 2 hours of yoga, followed by breakfast, followed by a morning circle where it was kind of a check-in, similar to something that you would do in rehab. At least that's how I would describe it. And the check-in sometimes was 15 minutes of dancing. Sometimes it was talking. Sometimes it was, these little exercises, kind of like a icebreaker stuff that Kobe and Pazit put together, the 2 leaders. But it was always pretty energetic. And then we would have I may get these out of order, but we would have a lecture type series, which I liked. It kind of satisfied the intellectual part for me. And that was either on the theory of Buddhism or yoga. Then we would have an hour and a half of meditation, kind of on and off. It wasn't just an hour and a half straight. You sit there. It was, do a little bit, talk a little bit, do a little bit, talk a little bit, so that you could build up those muscles. And then 2 hours more of yoga, and then another hour and a half of meditation. So all in, it was 4 hours of yoga, 3 hours of meditation each day. Very scripted, vegan diet, which was quite a struggle for me, but I did it pretty well. I pretty well adhered to it, minus a couple of cheating days. But that was basically the schedule.
So when you got back from Southeast Asia, which was pretty recently, you get back to the US, you get back to real life. How do you feel like all this stuff you've learned, I guess, interacts with or meshes with real life now? How are you maintaining it? Like, what's your recovery program looking like?
Yeah, so that's a good question. And I think, I've been back for just a couple of weeks now, and I don't know that I fully have the answer, but I'll tell you what I think is going to be the answer. I have been to one AA meeting at this point since I've been back, which is underperforming, but there's been a lot of stuff with family that I've had to take care of, folks sick in the family and stuff. But I think generally my plan is to follow a similar plan to that which I would have followed after rehab. So the stuff that they teach you there, I think, is still valuable and still important as you return to daily life. The difference is I just feel like I've built a few more muscles in the meantime. And so for me, it's, I'm thinking about 3 meetings a week. I'm working independently now. And so I've got my own little shared office space that's kind of my safe place to work, that's quiet, but I'm not jumping back into a 60-hour a week work week yet. I'm kind of easing back into that. And, I'm planning, as you and I have talked about a little bit, about building my next career move, sometime in the next year around the mental health space, which I think serves a few purposes. One is I think it's an attractive, space from a macro perspective in terms of the way the world is moving. But additionally, it's kind of in direct support of my recovery, daily working on things that are part of my recovery while also being part of my job, which is, obviously not everyone has the luxury of being able to do that. Well, I guess you do. I mean, anyone could do that if they want to. And, you see a lot of people within the mental health space who are in recovery themselves. And I think that's a surefire way to make sure you're focused on it each day. Doesn't guarantee recovery, but that you stay on recovery, but it does guarantee that you can't forget about it.
So what does going forward look like for you? Do you want to go back into entrepreneurship, or do you want to try something different? What's next?
Yeah, no, I definitely want to go back into entrepreneurship. I'm looking at the mental health space as a whole right now, but there are a couple things that are piquing my interest. One of which is sober living homes, which is, I guess, slightly ironic because I chose a different path. But I think that the the point that I find super important is not necessarily what you do when you're in early recovery, but that you do something very strongly. And whether that's going into sober living, 100 meetings in 100 days, both an IOP, a trip to Southeast Asia where you meditate all day, or whatever it might be, I think that, we don't have the luxury in early recovery of throwing ourselves back into the fray, or at least I didn't. It resulted in relapse. I mean, direct feedback, right? So it was not effective for me. And I think that sober living is a great way for people to be able to integrate back into the real world, but at a with training wheels. And I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean, I did the same thing. I secluded myself in Southeast Asia with a place that doesn't have alcohol. So I mean, I think that taking care of yourself and being careful in those early days is super important. And so that's one of the reasons why I'm looking at sober living homes. The other thing that I'm looking at is, another direct reflection of what I went through, which is, effectiveness of leaders within organizations and using mindfulness to help that. I think back to my last year in my role as CEO, and I was maybe working at 10%, Steve. I mean, I would spend hours looking at the computer trying to send an email because I was just in such a deep place of depression. And then you layer on, drinking on top of that. But I think back to how long I hid that and how much more successful we could have been had I been operating at 100% instead of 10%, or 30% instead of 10%. And so finding a way to provide some resources to, employees and or leaders and or entrepreneurs to be able to leverage some of these mindfulness skills that I picked up the hard way, whether they're suffering with something that's diagnosable or just the daily struggles of anxiety in life. I think that's something that is a need that could be addressed, especially from the, private equity and venture capital space where, you're betting a lot of money on this entrepreneur. And if he's walking with one arm tied behind his back, that's hindering the company and it's costing you a lot of money.
Yeah, no doubt. One thing I wanted to ask you about, since we're both military veterans, what is it in the veteran mentality that you think, like I had another veteran on recently on the podcast, and he talked about how he would never go to the VA. He would never ask for help. And it was like a mentality that was ingrained in him that, he's an academy grad, he's an officer, he doesn't need help. And finally, when he, ended up homeless, he said, maybe I need some help. Is there something going on in our culture around the military that makes it harder for guys like us or people like us to get help?
Yeah, I think there is, and I mean, it's the male community as a whole. I've been involved with the Movember campaign, and one of the things they talk about is how we don't ask for help very well. But I think it's exacerbated within first responders, military, police, the guys that are kind of the machismo sheepdogs of the community. And I think from my perspective, a great allegory for that is physical pain. And so, you think about how we handle physical pain within the military. I was in for 5 years and I never went to sick call once. I never went to the doctor, not one time in 5 years. Should I have gone to the doctor at one point in 5 years? Probably, right? But there's this, brush it off, play through the pain, rub some dirt on it mentality when it comes to physical pain. And the ironic part is we actually respect physical pain a little bit. We know what that is. And I think that's even taken to a higher level when you think about emotional and mental pain, which not only are we supposed to be able to play through pain, but we're not even supposed to have this pain, right? Big boys don't cry, stuff like that. And so, I think those two things combine into kind of a perfect storm of not getting help for emotional issues. And the other thing I think we think about is that somehow we think about dealing with your emotional issues as being emotional, right? You're whiny, you're weak when you deal with them. But the reality is the more you don't deal with them and the more you don't dive into them, the more emotionally dysregulated you get. And the more depressed you get and the more whatever you're dealing with kind of just grows and festers. And so, it's ironic that we, people use the term snowflake or whatever, but the worst thing you can do is not get help because that problem you have is only going to get worse, and then you're going to be more of what you don't want to be. Whereas if you dive into it and you respect those feelings, then you can actually make some progress.
Well, look, man, I really appreciate you coming on. If there's classmates of ours or military folks out there or veterans or anybody, entrepreneurs, investors, just regular everyday people, if there's anyone out there that is, thinks they might need to get help, where would you tell them is a good place to go first?
Oh man, that's a good question. I think it depends on what kind of help you need. I think if you're starting to struggle, or if you feel like something's just a bit off, then that's a great time to go see a therapist. I did that early on, and it's helpful. I think to the point where it starts to get more extreme, and to the point where you start to feel it. If you have a substance abuse problem, I think AA is a great place to go. There are a lot of people there who have been through it all and seen it all. And so they can give you great advice. If you're on your last leg, and if you're feeling, suicidal thoughts, or if you're, if dark blue turns to black, then, check yourself in somewhere. And it's really hard to drop your pride to do that. I mean, I remember how I felt a few times when I knew it was the right decision before I made it. But you say, oh, well, I can't take 30 days off. I've got kids. I've got a job. I've heard the I've got kids excuse for a long time. And I call it an excuse for a reason, because, if you've got a 5-year-old and a 7-year-old, or if you've got 2 young kids and you're deeply depressed, the worst thing that you can do for them is to do that for another 12 years. So sometimes 30 days is, maybe what you need to be able to be there for your kids for the next 15 years, or be successful in your career for the next 15 years, or whatever. So it's a hit, man, for sure. You're taking time off of life. You're hitting the pause button, but it can be really helpful. So I think, therapist, AA, friends and family, there are a lot of good groups on Facebook as well. But I think, with your podcast, Steve, I mean, one of the things that it's called stigma, right? And so that's what we worry about. But I will tell you that ever since I've started telling people about my depression and substance abuse issues, I've had nothing but support. And, it's a hell of a lot better to be in recovery than be a drunk. And you think no one knows, but they do. So.
Yeah, it's incredible when you raise your hand and say, I need help. I mean, people help. And this facade that you think exists around everybody in your life, it seems to disappear, because people will just say, I appreciate your vulnerability and I want to help you. So just reaching out and asking for help there's so many ways to do it. And that's the key.
Yeah. The key is just doing it.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Just do it. Well, look, man, I really appreciate you coming on and sharing your story. I think this is going to help a lot of folks. So dude, thanks for doing this, man.
Yeah, no worries, Steve. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks again, Nick, for being here, man. I really appreciate it. And I think this conversation is going to help a lot of people who are on the fence about getting help, or maybe people with our similar backgrounds that have not been willing to get help. So I appreciate you coming on and taking the time to share with us. For our listeners, as a reminder, you can connect directly with Nick a number of ways. I will link those in the show notes. And last but not least, if you like this episode, please feel free to share it on social media. We'd be grateful if you would rate, review, subscribe, etc. to the Stigma Podcast on iTunes or whatever platform you prefer. Helps our show a lot in rankings and would really be appreciated. If you have any comments or questions, we'd love to hear from you. And finally, you can connect with us on Twitter at StigmaCast, and you can find us on our website at stigmapodcast.com. Thanks for being here.